Afternoon. I'm Garrett Graff. I'm the director of the Cyber Initiative at the Aspen Institute here with Aspen Digital. And thank you so much for joining our webinar today, looking at the domestic U.S. cyber risks and geopolitical digital cyber implications for the increased tensions between Russia and Ukraine. We have a great, fascinating set of panelists and discussions today. This is being broadcast live on YouTube as well as on our website, and we are looking forward to a great discussion. There will be time for Q&A at the end of our program today. We are going to start today with a keynote address from Jen Easterly, the second director of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency at the Department of Homeland Security. Afterwards, then we will go into a panel discussion moderated by Director Easterly's predecessor at CISA, Chris Krebs, the Senior Newmark Cybersecurity Fellow here at Aspen Digital, along with Sandra Joyce from Mandiant and Herb Lin from Stanford. Two other Aspen Digital programs I want to mention that we will provide some more information about in the chat today. The Aspen Tech Policy Hub is working right now to recruit applications through the end of this month for its Aspen Climate Cohort, a 10-week program running this summer helping to train climate scientists and technologists to engage in the policy process. Applicants of all backgrounds with technical expertise in climate change are encouraged to apply and will be paid an $18,000 stipend to enable this participation. There's an info session next week on that, and we'll be posting about it in the chat as well. Also, Aspen Digital is working with HP on a program recently launched, a digital accelerator to help scale nonprofits working on digital equity issues around the world. We're launching pilot projects in the United States, India, and Morocco. And next week as well, we will be having information sessions for applicants to the summer 2022 cohort. It's a great opportunity for nonprofits interested in applying to learn more about what will help them stand out and ask questions about the program. We'll be linking to that as well. But first, today, let me welcome Jen Easterly, the second director of CISA, who is working hard to try to make sure that our country is ready and resilient for whatever may unfold geopolitically over the next couple of weeks. Director Easterly?
Hey, thanks very much, Garrett. I really appreciate the kind introduction, and thanks, of course, to Aspen for hosting the event today. It clearly is a very timely venue to discuss critical infrastructure resilience as the world braces for a potential escalation at the Ukraine-Russia border. And while that border may be over 5,000 miles away, and there are no specific credible threats to the U.S. homeland that we know of currently, we all recognize that threats to our digital infrastructure are, of course, not bound by national borders. And we saw that very starkly in July of 2017 during the NotPetya incident. Our networks and our critical infrastructure are integrated into a larger global cyber ecosystem, which means that we all need to be ready, as I like to say, shields up. So given the rising tensions and the potential invasion of Ukraine by Russia, we've actually been leaning forward to inform our industry partners of potential threats, really as part of a paradigm shift that I've been talking about for a while now, of moving from the government being reactive to being much more proactive. And in this role, we have been leading a national campaign to ensure that senior leaders and network defenders are prepared to manage such a threat. So a couple of things we've been doing that folks should be aware of. Starting in late 2021, we began a very robust outreach campaign in our role as National Coordinator for Critical Infrastructure Resilience and Security. So pulling together the interagency to help critical infrastructure have the information necessary to be as prepared as possible for any escalation that might pose a potential threat to the homeland. And that included classified and unclassified briefings to our private sector and state and local partners regarding evolving cybersecurity risks. We also released many products. One in particular was a joint cybersecurity advisory with our teammates at FBI and NSA in January, about the Russian threat to U.S. critical infrastructure. It included specific tactics, techniques, procedures associated with Russian actors. Very important to get that one in particular to network defenders. And we also put out separately an advisory that was more executive level for CEOs and business leaders that urged every organization to take urgent and near-term steps to reduce the likelihood and impact of a potentially damaging compromise. We also have a dedicated public webpage that provides an overview of the Russian government's malicious cyber activities, as well as a collection of all our advisories and products on Russian state-sponsored cyber threats. And then we just stood up a new Shields Up webpage. So if you go to CISA.gov, you will see Shields Up. And the page includes the latest guidance on how organizations, regardless of size, can adopt a heightened posture when it comes to cybersecurity and protecting their most critical assets. So what should companies and organizations be doing today? Well, we recommend 4 basic things, but also go to the website and check out greater details. First of all, reducing the likelihood of a damaging cyber intrusion, making sure that MFA, multi-factor authentication, is enabled, that your software is up to date, that your patches have been implemented. Take steps to quickly detect a potential intrusion, make sure that logging is enabled, confirm that you have the antivirus, the anti-malware software and signatures updated. 3, ensure that your organization is prepared to respond if an incident occurs, that your crisis response team is ready to go, and that hopefully by now you've exercised your plan to make sure that everyone understands roles and responsibilities in the event of a significant incident. And then finally, maximizing your organization's resilience by testing backup procedures and manual controls, in particular for industrial control systems or operational technology, to ensure that critical functions can remain operable in the event of a compromise. Now, we've been putting this information out for months now, so I hope this sounds very familiar to anybody from industry that we have out there. But again, please go to the website. I would say of the guidance that we have been providing, perhaps the most critical is that organizations need to lower their thresholds for escalating anomalous activity and sharing that information with the government, whether that's CISA at CISO Central or our teammates at FBI at SciWatch or at an FBI field office. Just get that information to the government and rest assured that we are very tightly connected, and we will share that information to ensure that we can protect the security of the US. And this is crucial because we all recognize that early warnings of a cyber attack affecting US organizations are frankly going to be identified by very likely a private company first rather than the government, as we've seen with many of the cyber campaigns throughout the past year. And our goal is to ensure that we are connecting the dots between seemingly disparate events so we can identify and work to remediate an emerging campaign as rapidly as possible. To support all of these efforts, we have stood up dedicated operational collaboration channels on this issue with key cybersecurity and technology companies through our Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative, many of you familiar with by now, the JCDC, a collection of more than 20 private sector companies, the biggest technology companies in the world, ISPs, cloud providers, major cybersecurity companies like our friends at Mandia. You'll hear from Sandra in a couple minutes. And these companies have visibility into networks and can help us to understand the threat landscape in the ways that we don't have that visibility. And so the theory of the case here is that the partners in the JCDC come together with the government to help us see the dots, connect the dots, and then collectively drive down risk to the nation at scale. And we've had some pretty good success in the short lifetime of the JCDC, about 5 months old now. We've been standing shoulder to shoulder with our industry partners, and particularly throughout Log4Shell, turning us from partnership into true operational collaboration. During that period of time, we stood up the Slack channel. That sounds super simple and primitive for everybody out there in the private sector, but it's actually pretty novel to stand that up very quickly and bring in the government and bring in the private sector to share near real-time information to help create that picture of the threat. Stood up a GitHub site that made us the authoritative source on vulnerabilities. And we did that with industry and academia, as well as the fantastic research community. As you know, here at CISA, we are huge advocates for anyone out there, researchers, academics, hackers, reporters who willingly and responsibly disclose vulnerabilities to us. So I think at this point in time, we are quicker, we are more nimble, we are more connected than we've ever been. And that's allowing us to help be better prepared for this moment. As my good friend Chris Inglis likes to say, the JCDC is not a club, it's an engine. So we just announced, and I love this idea, we just announced a catalog of free services available to those critical infrastructure owners and operators who need access to tools that will keep them resilient. We know that big companies can afford to bring in cybersecurity folks to help them. But then there's the category of those we call target rich, resource poor. And so this catalog includes services from CISA, open source tools, but also free offerings from our JCDC partners, malware and antivirus protection, vulnerability assessment solutions, tools that test password strength, DDoS protection services, intel from several leading cybersecurity companies, all free. For all of our partners, whether that's critical infrastructure or partners at state and local. So I think those will be very helpful, and we wanted to get that out so that organizations can take advantage of it. This is version 1.0. That catalog will grow and mature, but check out CISA.gov. And check out some of those services there. You know, I fundamentally believe that this sort of whole of ecosystem operational collaboration model is really going to move us from a place where it's just about basic information sharing into enabling. And everything we're focused on now is providing timely, relevant, and most importantly, actionable data that can be used by network defenders across the community to increase the security and resilience of their networks. I want to close on one other aspect, because while we are completely shields up in critical infrastructure cybersecurity, we are also working to prepare for and mitigate foreign influence operations. We know that given rising tensions, foreign actors may use influence operations to spread mis, dis, and malinformation, or MDM narratives, to bias the development of policy and undermine the security of the US. And so we are very focused on that. We'll be putting out a product shortly. We may even bring back the famous pineapple tutorial, Chris. We're going to launch a product which essentially provides guidance on how to identify and mitigate the risks of MDM narratives and operations. And so we're encouraging all organizations to take steps, both internally and externally, to ensure that they can react to information manipulation. So finally, I would just say, make sure you are availing yourselves of CISA resources. If you have any questions about tools, services, information, please let us know. Our job is to understand, manage, and reduce risk to our nation's critical systems. So we are here to be your collaborative partner as America's Cyber Defense Agency. So thanks, Chris, for giving me the opportunity, and I hope the rest of the panel is fantastic.
Director Easterly, thanks so much for those opening comments. I think you covered a lot of waterfront, including some of the resources available to various organizations out there, but also some of the initiatives that you've kicked off in your tenure. I've been quite impressed with the US government's efforts to get actionable information out to the private sector, to state and local governments, to federal partners, but also convening in various fora a range of organizations so that they can share information and then get on top of these threats. And I think the one kind of key here that I'd point out is that, look, I think we've all been hearing about what may happen in Ukraine now, not just for a couple of days, not just for a couple of weeks, but really for months. And it at times, particularly when you continue to brief your leadership, it can get a little tiring and stressing. But this is not the moment, I think, to kind of let down your guard. In fact, this is a moment to redouble your efforts, as you pointed out. And I loved seeing Shields Up last week. So Director Easterly, again, thanks for everything you've been doing, and the team at CISA and the rest of the national defenders within the US government have been leading over the last several months.
Awesome. Okay. Thanks, brother.
All righty. Okay, so what we're going to do today is kick into a bit of a fireside chat, a question and answer session with two Aspen Institute, Aspen Digital affiliated experts, and get into kind of where we are in the situation, where this might go, and ultimately what are some of the threads that are playing out across the Eastern Europe and elsewhere. And I think before we get there, though, particularly if you've been watching any of the news alerts today, Twitter, wherever, it does seem as if within the last 24 to 36 hours, things are heating up in the east of Ukraine. Just earlier today, there was some reporting on where the U.S. government had declassified or released some information about potential assassination lists that the Russians had developed for within former officials within Ukraine. So before we get into some of the technical aspects that we all like talking about, I think it is critical to acknowledge and recognize the fact that while we don't know exactly how this is going to play out, if it plays out, if Russia invades, if Putin decides to invade, there's no question that this has all the hallmarks of a potential tragic humanitarian crisis with massive loss of life, dislocation and displacement of people, refugees. And it's just a sad state of affairs that it's gotten to this point. And I think that's in part what is behind some of the U.S. government efforts to be radically transparent, as they're calling it, get the plans out there that they've come across from an intelligence perspective. So let's jump into it now. I'm going to introduce our panelists, and then we'll get into a bit of the Q&A. So I'd like to start with Sandra Joyce. Sandra is an executive VP and head of global threat intelligence at Mandiant. She oversees intelligence collection, research analysis, and support services for threat intelligence customers and the Mandiant security product portfolio. Also a friend of mine, and it's great to see you here today, Sandra.
Thank you for having me.
We've also got another friend that I've worked with for quite some time, Dr. Herb Lin. He's a senior research scholar for cyber policy and security at the Center for International Security and Cooperation and the Hank J. Holland Fellow in Cyber Policy and Security at the Hoover Institution, both at Stanford University. Dr. Lin is particularly interested in the use of offensive operations in cyberspace as instruments of national policy and in the security dimensions of information warfare and influence operations on national security. I had the honor of working with Herb on Aspen, the Aspen Commission on Information Disorder. We wrapped up that effort last October and released about 15 recommendations on how we can address at the national level here in the US some of the disinformation issues that we had faced on a daily basis. So, all right, Sandra, if I can start with you. I think what would be helpful is setting a little bit of context. So Mandiant obviously is a global operation, a lot of telemetry and incident response, forensics analysis globally. And so you probably have a pretty good sense of what has happened to date. So are you able to can you walk us through what we've seen from a cyber perspective, a technical perspective over the last several months in Ukraine, and then maybe give us a sense of what you and your team at Mandiant might be expecting to see here in the US, in the West, and also in Ukraine in the coming days, weeks, or months?
Yeah, I'm happy to, Chris. So the way to think about it is we've seen activity that really falls into three main areas: softening of the target within Ukraine, domestic positioning within Russia, and then what that so-called casus belli, so that, cause for war kind of activity. We track a group called UNC 1151. This is the group that has been conducting what we call the Ghost Rider campaign. A lot of information operations against groups in Germany, Latvia, Poland, and really looking at pushing narratives that are anti-NATO. So they've been just really doing and conducting a lot of intrusions against organizations that have a critical role within the Ukraine territory. We also have been seeing a group that we've tracked for a long time called Secondary Infection. This is what we believe is a Russian-backed information operations group. And really, we've seen 4 recent operations from November 2021 to February this month, where they pushed anti-Ukraine messaging, attempting to drive a wedge between Ukraine and NATO countries, particularly Poland and Germany. In fact, we saw a fake map that had been disseminated showing a sort of an occupation of Polish soldiers along the border of Ukraine, something that is designed to really get the domestic audiences in those countries to start to feel negatively towards their own government. We've also seen Russian domestic audiences targeted with information operations campaigns that have really been victims of this are looking at lies around humanitarian crises that supposedly have been perpetrated by the Ukrainian government. Along with that, we've seen DDoS, or distributed denial of service, attacks against banks. This was widely reported, but even more interesting than that was the follow-on SMS spam. So messages going out to bank customers telling them that their bank doesn't work, that the website is down, which has a twofold effect. One, it drives more traffic to the bank itself, feeding that DDoS incident, but also, and probably more importantly, driving up that fear, driving up the uncertainty around, can the Ukrainian government protect itself, undermining the confidence that is there. So really, all of this goes to show we really are watching these active measures, these softening of the target within Ukraine, domestic positioning within Russia, and then really looking at how can Russia put out a message that could be interpreted as a cause for war. So we're seeing all of that happening over the last couple of months and weeks.
If I can pull a quick thread real quick and then hop over to her, but back to you real quick for one follow-up, Sandra. You had a blog post earlier this week talking a little bit about, trying to put into context what some of these events are. And at the same time happening across Twitter, I'm unfortunately extremely online and on Twitter all the time. There was a lot of debate on whether a DDoS attack against a bank or a Ministry of Defense or website defacement or SMS spam, whether these actually constituted attacks. Mm-hmm. And I think, if looking in isolation, if you'd seen a website defacement on the government of Chile or Australia, you probably wouldn't think much of it. But as I see it within an area of geopolitical tension, I think, I pay attention to all the signals. So can you dive in a little bit more about how you think about the spectrum of attacks, what might, and how to put that into context for us as we're looking at things develop?
When I think about cyber attack, there's that traditional definition, right? Deny, destroy, disrupt, deceive. Those are pretty clearly, going under this bucket of cyber attack. But to me, what's more interesting is really not the mode, not the level of sophistication, but really it's the effects, it's the outcomes. An operation can be very low tech, but have tremendous outcomes. In the case of the DDoS attack against the banks, sure, DDoS is not something that is on the high priority list of threats. It is relatively easily mitigated. But what was interesting was the follow-on information campaign, pushing people through the SMS text spam and pushing them back to the banks to look at the website, to perpetrate and to promulgate the fear factor. So to me, the semantics around whether it's an attack or not are less important than really were the outcomes reached, were the goals achieved by the perpetrator of these things, and to what measure. I think that's a fuller way to look at what we're talking about when we think about cyber attack.
I think that's right. I think I'd agree with that. And so kind of building on this gray zone space where we see activities that don't necessarily cost a lot on the adversary side, and the impact is a little nebulous on the target side. We have heard, Herb, you've talked about from a nuclear perspective the cybersecurity risks with the nuclear arsenal. You're also an expert in offensive security. Can you give us a sense of, from your perspective at least, what you might expect in the coming days and weeks in Ukraine, and how to think about escalation? What would be some of the limiting parameters for Russian operations, both in Ukraine and in Europe and here in the US, that where we might see activity X, but not necessarily activity Y?
Okay. Let's see. On the first, I think that if an attack actually happens, and by attack I mean a kinetic attack, with troops invading and so on, there's a full-fledged military operation. I think at that point, many of the operations that have been going on, I think will still continue. There is also the question of the extent to which you will see attacks on infrastructure, perhaps Ukrainian, perhaps non-Ukrainian, that helps the Ukrainians fight the war. So, for example, to the extent that that Ukraine relies on space assets for reconnaissance and these would be commercial space assets, right? Commercial satellites who tell you where Russian troops are massing and so on. Those kinds of companies may well be attacked as well, to shut down intelligence feeds to the Ukrainian military. So I mean, just as one example. So I think we'll see a broader range of attacks where they basically intended to cripple many of the military functions that the Ukrainian armed forces are going to be undertaking. On the escalation side, yes, I mean there are. You worry about escalation in both nuclear and in cyber and conventionally. I don't want to say in any sense that the effects of cyber operations, escalatory cyber operations, are anything like going nuclear. I mean, I'm not anticipating going nuclear on this. No way. But the theory of escalation is has to be thought about here, which is that you escalate with the idea that you can force the other guy back down, that you want to cause them pain enough so that they stop doing what they're doing, or to influence their decision making. And then you have to, if you decide to escalate, you have to worry about his counter escalation. And so it just builds up on each other. And in the end there, really, you either get off the escalatory ladder or you go all the way down to the mat. I don't expect that to happen immediately, but it may well become a test of who has the strongest, the largest pain tolerance. And that's a dangerous, place to be, and it could well spread to other nations. For example, nations that are supporting Ukraine in their efforts. So
I mean, I think to put a bit of a finer point on it, I would stipulate that as a part of any sort of ground force movement by the Russians, if they decide to invade, would probably be preceded by some combination of cyber attacks on civilian infrastructure, power grids, like what we saw with the Sandworm efforts in 2015 and 16, combined probably with some electronic warfare against telecommunications network. To your point, dazzling jamming of satellite, both communications and other sort of remote ground sensing. What do you think, again, stipulating that Ukraine will have those sorts of targets that could even be destructive? What do you, from an escalatory perspective, what would the US and allies, what sort of steps up the ladder would have to happen for Russia to turn the GRU, the FSB, the SVR, or any Belarusian assets or others against, as you've heard from the US government in the banks, DOJ yesterday with their notice to banks? What do you think it would take to get there? Just again, national assets, so distinct, aligned, state-sponsored and controlled forces.
I think what you're asking is will they be attacking them? Will they be attacking sort of critical infrastructure in some Ukrainian critical infrastructure, power grids, banks, and so on? And I expect them to be doing that now, or at least planting the seeds to enable them to do it now, essentially at will. Ukraine has had a long history of being the test bed for Russian cyber operations. They've been victimized a lot. I have no particular reason to believe that they're going to necessarily do very much better now than in the past. So I expect if the balloon goes up for them to be compromised in ways that actually there are two effects. One, that it actually cripples useful national functions like providing power, and two is it creates panic and uncertainty about the ability of the Ukraine government to protect them. So the example with the banks and so on, is my money still there? That's a big deal. lots of people are going to be concerned about that. So that's an example of it. You might see attacks on hospitals, where you shut down hospitals and people can't get to the hospital and so on. Might not actually be a have actual medical impact on a large scale, but certainly a lot of, if there were troops coming in and so on, and I was uncertain about my ability to get medical care and so on in case there was shelling, so I sure want to get out of the way. And so, this is a way of, driving refugee flows and stuff like that.
So I think I agree with that, particularly with what's going on in Ukraine. So Sandra, let's shift back over to you. And there's a lot of, are they, aren't they? Are the Russians going to go? Aren't they going to go? There's a lot of anticipation of, as we already talked about, what constitutes an attack. And so that's it. I don't want to go as far to say there's a lot of admiring the problem, but ultimately you have to ask the question, so what? And then what do we do about it? And so from a Mandiant perspective, from where you sit, how are y'all thinking about some of the threats that we may face here in the U.S., separate from the geographically limited attacks within Ukraine? How are you thinking about, and how are you talking to organizations when Kevin goes out on the road, when y'all are out there on the road? How are you talking to businesses about what the specific risks we may face here?
Well, really, it's the message is it's not a panic moment, it's a mission moment. So prepare, but don't panic, because we've weathered cyber attacks in the past. If there's been anything good that's come from years of Russian cyber activity aimed at the United States, it's been that we've enumerated a good portion of the Russian cyber capability. We have a lot of information about their TTPs, about threat actors, and businesses and cyber defenders know what they need to do in order to defend themselves. If not, they can look at what Director Easterly had put out, what she mentioned about the Shields Up advisory. Some of these things just are aimed at making yourself not the lowest hanging fruit, making sure that you are resilient, and that when and if an attack or some kind of breach were to happen, that you have a tabletop exercise that you've already run, that you know what the plan is to mitigate, and then frankly, to get back to work. Because we need to be resilient. Cyber attacks and cyber activity is here to stay, and we need to be resilient and push forward and not panic, but certainly be prepared. And again, Director Easterly Shields Up Advisory is a great document full of very good information. We also published a hardening advisory ourselves on how organizations can protect themselves. I think there's a lot of really great information that's out there that businesses, if they're waiting for, it is time to stop waiting and go ahead and get prepared now.
Yeah, we're doing the same thing. I think you have time now to prepare, take some of the measures. The other issue is, kind of don't let a good crisis go to waste.
Right.
This is certainly not the first or last geopolitical crisis that will have some function of technological exploitation, and it's smart to get your house in order now. All right, so I'm going to do one more question before we open it up to some of the audience questions. But just to make this issue that much more complex, everybody, of course, remembers Colonial Pipeline from last year, JBS meats. I, living in the DC area, couldn't get gas for a few days last summer. And that kicked off an effort on behalf of the National Security Council under Ann Neuberger, the Deputy National Security Advisor, working with the Kremlin, working with her counterparts at the Russian National Security Council, of trying to defang and undercut the cyber criminal element that seems to be operating out of a safe harbor or safe haven in Russia. And interestingly, over the last several weeks or months, you've actually seen the security services in the Kremlin take some actions and roll up the REvil group. Now, it's not clear if they're the developers or the affiliates, and then you've seen some other actions against some other malware developers. But what do Herb, I'll start with you. What do you make of this? How does it fit into the broader context? The actually exerting in a really coincidental time influence and control over these ransomware groups.
It can't possibly be an accident that this happened at this time, right? I mean, I don't think anybody on this call or anybody on the panelists or in the audience possibly believes that it was coincidence. Okay, so the question is, why would the Russians attempt to roll up this group? As you point out, first of all, we don't know who they rolled up. We have a press announcement and so on. To the best of my knowledge, we haven't gained access to any of them. We haven't been able to question them. We don't know really anything about the roles that they play. Let's assume that they're key players, that they're really big. They're not the low-level guys that hold the door open while the real players go to work. What Russia has done is it's pointed out, hi, we have these people and we can control them. We can turn them on, we can turn them off, or, and by implication, we can turn them on. I think it's a pointed reminder from the Russians that they have a variety of sort of non-traditional resources at their disposal. I think that's the lesson that we should be taking from it. And we can do what we can take that information as we see fit. Now, everybody here knew that already, but it's just their way of reminding us. That's my take on it.
Yeah, I mean, look, I gotta agree. It's kind of ridiculously coincidental, and it's interesting. It's a deniable, reversible asset. So, Sandra, I'm going to give you a chance to jump in and how you're thinking about this issue as well.
Oh, I think the timing is suspect for sure, but it really doesn't matter. You know why? Because today, Manny and IR responders are going to help customers all over the place who are victims of ransomware. It is still hugely active. And one of the reasons is a lot of these ransomware operators have affiliates that once one operation shuts down, they simply go and either are already connected to or are already serving under a different group. So the problem is, the arrests are, a blip in the actual, outcome in terms of reducing ransomware. It is simply in my view, a way to try and obfuscate or confuse the situation to bring in, like some kind of activity that Russia's doing to help, so that we can be just, confused or just, misdirected from what's happening now. So right now, I'm not buying it, and I don't think anybody should be buying it.
I think I'll give the White House maybe a little credit for engaging in dialogue and apparently getting some sort of outcome. But I think to the broader point that both Herb and Sandra you've made is that this smacks of a bit of gangster diplomacy, and that, hey, look, we can work on this thing here. Don't pay attention to what we're doing over here. And it's also entirely consistent with my feeling over the last several years that the Kremlin has been turning a blind eye, knowing full well what the criminal assets in their country and within their orbit. I mean, just the fact that one of the first checks that the developer, the malware does is looks for the Cyrillic language package on machines. So, they've been developing this strategic cyber capability through criminal gangs over the last several years. And it's also aligned with the broader kind of objectives of the security services in the Kremlin to destabilize the West. All right, so we've got a few minutes, and we've got a couple questions coming in from the audience, and there's one from Peter Wolverton from the Fletcher School. I love this question. I was talking about it a little bit earlier today as well. So I'm just going to throw this. Let's throw this, Herb, first to you. How effective has the U.S. been in its strategic declassification of intelligence in order to counteract Russian false flag disinformation, both within and outside of Russia and Ukraine? You've seen it. You see it today. You've seen it all week. You've seen it. How effective has this been in your view?
It's certainly been much more effective than we've ever done it before. Whether it's adequate or not, that's a different question. We don't know how it's narrowing Russia's options and so on, but they've certainly done a whole lot better now compared to 4 years ago, or 5 years ago, with the when Russian interference in the election was noted. That stuff was very, very tightly held, and you know, it's just not now. I think people understand that there are imperatives to get out, even if you might take some risk with your sources and methods and so on, compromising those. But I mean, hats off to them for doing as much as they've done. But you know, sort of a B plus. They should be doing better. You know, we want them to be encouraging them to do better. No A pluses yet.
Well, I'm an easy grader, so I'm not afraid to throw out a couple A pluses right here.
Okay.
Having been a part of counteractive measures efforts over the last several years, it's quite remarkable to me, at least the tactical and strategic shifts. But you know, Sandra, So kind of Sandra, same question to you, and then maybe a broader thinking out loud question of how far can this go? How much further can we take it? What are the risks possibly associated with it?
I'm very encouraged by what I've been seeing in the quick declassification of information. If not only because when we're talking about, you know, a purveyor of misinformation like Russia, we really neuter the message if we can spotlight it. We can neuter the effect of influence operations if we can debunk it or declassify information about intentions beforehand. So I agree. I'm a hard grader, but I'm still giving it an A, because knowing where we've come from and where we are now, I think it's been a tremendous step forward for the government on, you know, making sure that we can declassify in time to make an effect. The days of taking years to attribute activity, those days are over. They help nobody. And what we're doing now, I think, is the exact right thing.
I think I'd add the fact that there's a sense of proactiveness, of strategy around it, where I think over the last several years, we've been a little bit more tentative and reactive. Now it feels like there's a real game plan. And you know, Herb, one of the things that we recommended, right, in the Aspen Commission on Information Disorder was a federal strategic approach to countering disinformation. And so it seems like there's something afoot here. So I'm encouraged to see where this goes and see how much more we can use it. And kind of with the added side benefit of not only does it expose the operation, it also, I think, throws probably a little bit of uncertainty into the head of the Kremlin leadership, including Putin, of maybe he doesn't have his operational security locked down. Maybe they've got some leaks. And of course, that can cut the other way, right? They can start doing some intentional planting of false information, false flags in it on themselves. So, all right, let's change gears here a little bit. So, of course, Ukraine is not a member of NATO. In fact, that might even at least be the cover story here that the Russians are using, that they want to prevent that. And yet they share a border with at least one NATO member in Poland. And in fact, they're quite close. So what is the role here of NATO from a cyber perspective? You have the London statement from a couple of years ago that did in fact include cyber attacks as potentially invoking Article 5 responses. I've had this same question of what does cyber really mean in an Article 5 context. When you look at the specific language, it says it restores security and stability. And I don't know what that looks like. So Herb, I think you've probably looked at this in the past, but there's a question here from Stephanie Helm from the Mass Cyber Center. Is there any role for the NATO Cyber Defense Center or US Cyber Mission Forces? What contributions can they make to counter Russian or sympathizer cyber actions? And I think probably the best way to frame this up is if there's any sort of spillover or collateral damage on Poland, how could NATO play a role here?
Well, if it's spillover or collateral damage, then by definition it's unintentional, and we try to talk to the Russians about that and say you did something, and they acknowledge that it's unintentional. That's not going to happen, right? So the question is there any, should we be bolstering cyber defenses for NATO, for the bordering NATO countries? And the answer is yes, and I think we have been helping them. I would be amazed if U.S. Cyber Command had not been all over the place in Europe and working with NATO and so on. Perhaps a more important question, and I don't know the answer to this, is whether or not we will be willing to deploy any offensive capabilities in support of the NATO countries. That's of course a different, a lower threshold than actually sending troops that will go and shoot people. And that I don't know. And I think there are many escalatory questions that I don't know that anybody's thought about them. I mean, I would be surprised if they haven't thought about them, but I don't know what they've been thinking about.
And I think that kind of really gets to the heart of what an Article 5 response is under NATO. What does restoring stability and security mean in practice from a side? I mean, that doesn't mean that you're going in and you're attacking a pipeline or the grid around Moscow. There has to be, I would imagine, some sort of rules of engagement around hitting command and control infrastructure or something to that effect. Which could, to your point, to your point on escalation, that could invoke some kind of a CTSO response, and all of a sudden you've got, Sandra, I'm sure you can talk to us about Belarus and some of their capabilities. So I think this is right. So let's kind of pivot here a little bit. And Sandra, there's a question we have from Anonymous. I'm not sure if that's the collective or they just didn't give us their name. But what are the hurdles to attributing cyber attacks to Russia quickly and accurately? So obviously y'all have a whole an alphabet or rather a zoo of animal names or whatever, number names and all that stuff. It's the other guys that have the animal names. Y'all have the number names. So how do y'all work through the attribution process? And we've seen really fast attribution in some cases, and other times it takes a little bit longer. So what are the hurdles and benefits here?
Well, there certainly are hurdles because, especially with new groups, backing up a little bit, the way that we do attribution work is we look at years worth of data on clusters of activity. And over time, we can, when we cluster these, we can start to see overlapping infrastructure. We can start to understand, targets and areas where there's overlap. And then, what we do there is we classify it as an UNC or unclassified group because we can only attribute the activity, but not back to, a sponsor. With an APT designation, we've gone all the way, but that does take time. And it takes time because, these are spies who are doing everything possible to obfuscate their activity. We have the benefit of having tracked these groups for a very long time. So when we see the same group or we have a lot of data behind that group, it's easier for us to recognize that this is, a cluster of activity that is very familiar to us. The difficulty is that these groups are actively trying to hide their tracks. And it takes very careful work, and it takes very, down to the forensic level to understand, not just what the tradecraft is or the behavior behind it or the infrastructure, the command and control. It's all of those things, but also, who benefits from this type of activity, looking at from an analytical perspective against that geopolitical backdrop, who would be doing this and why. I can tell you that with a lot of the Ghostwriter campaign, for a while, it was suspected Russian groups, but until we could put more technical evidence on there, it became clear to us that it was Belarus, an organization, stemming from there. So over time, the picture becomes clear because more and more evidence can come together.
So let's take another couple questions from the audience. We've got TJ Harrington from McKinsey that's got a couple questions in here that are good. So I'm going to take both of them, and I'm going to give one to you first, Herb, and then I got another one for you, Sandra. So first, so Herb, a lot has changed over the last couple years in terms of rule of engagement, authorities for cyber operations, particularly here in the U.S. with Cyber Command. Based on what your understanding, some of the discussions that we've been having in Congress and the policy spheres, how are we dealing right now from a rules of engagement perspective? And what is the ideal posture to enable our cyber warriors, as they may be, as TJ says here. What are the appropriate updated rules of engagement for our cyber warriors to allow them to actively engage in critical infrastructure defense? And I think let's split that off and let's talk about supporting allies over there. Let's just focus on that part right now.
Well, okay, so from my standpoint, the rules of engagement regarding defensive operations are relatively straightforward. Certainly, if you're talking about stuff that will not have an offensive effect on not harm adversary systems, then I think that you can basically do whatever you want, and that's there's very little controversy about that. The real questions here are, I think, what does it mean to conduct an offensive operation in cyberspace to go after your tormentor? There's and here the distinction is between offensive operations taken with the intent of being defensive, or offensive operations taken with the intent of projecting power, cyber power, into the other guy's system that will sort of teach him a lesson, as opposed to defeat a threat, a specific threat. And U.S. Cyber Command has looser rules of engagement, as I understand it, under its approach of persistent engagement and defending forward. It says, let's be out there for defensive purposes, but in the other guy's networks, doing things that force them to do defense. And therefore shifting some of their resources out of offense into defense, and thereby weakening their defense. So this is something that I think is looser than it was under certainly under the Obama administration. I think that there's a fundamental tension between centralizing your authorities for conducting offensive operations for whatever purpose, and which you want centralized control because you want people to be able to weigh the different equities, the different costs and benefits from a diplomatic perspective, economic perspective, and so on. But that takes longer, and you're much slower that way. And so, you could argue that under the Obama administration, things happened on the offensive side just too slowly. And that's the reason for new rules, for greater flexibility. I have some sympathy with that. On the other hand, when you decentralize it a little bit, more, you increase the possibility of inadvertent escalation. That the guys in the field are going to take some action that's going to have some untoward effect that they didn't anticipate, and our national command authority, the president's going to have to deal with the repercussions of that. So there's no perfect balance to it, and I think we're still in the process of experimentation.
Yeah, I think that's right. And there are a few other questions in here kind of about that escalatory nature and what what a punchback is. So Sandra, real quick, there's a question, another one from TJ from McKinsey here. What is the advice to U.S. international companies with operations in Russia and China? They have Russian code writers, Russian employees with access to their systems. What risk assessments should be underway? I'm going to take that question and shift it a little bit. How are you? What are you doing with companies that have operations in Ukraine right now? Whether it's a footprint, whether it's a workforce, whether they have third-party dependencies, code writers. I mean, they're brilliant software engineers in Ukraine. And so how are we thinking about those dependencies, and what should organizations be doing right now to protect themselves?
It really is about vigilance, understanding that right now organizations in Ukraine should be at a heightened alert if they aren't already. I think that goes without saying. But when we think about the threat landscape and what Russia has already started to do with, defacements and, some wiping activity and spear phishing, every organization that's in Ukraine, particularly those that are in critical infrastructure, really should be thinking about their defensive posture, doing the same things that we're asking American businesses to do, to be ready and to understand that they could be on a target list, it could very well be not even because they are core to any military or economic function, but because their breach or the network going down would have information operations value. So it would have a fear factor. So that could be newspapers. It could be famous or highly visible organizations. They really need to be thinking about themselves within, what is their threat profile when it comes to Russian objectives. I think that's the way to look at it.
And as I think about what could be coming over the course of the next couple of days, I think similar to you, have bucketed up into three sorts of cyber actions. First is anything that may hit Ukraine, and then you could have some sort of network connection that could spill outside of the country. The second is some sort of ransomware event like NotPetya that may not be geographically limited to Ukraine and could have some wormable capability that would spread globally. And the third is more that directed activity against U.S. infrastructure. So we've got a question here from Joe Uchil from Joe, I forgot where you're with, but from a practical standpoint, what level of Russian cyber activity and to whom will it take for the U.S. to treat it as escalatory? What would fall under that radar? So Herb, you've talked a lot about escalation ladder. What are the things that would be, immediately take it up above that red line, which is a uniquely American concept?
Well, so for example, a big thing they could do would be to pull down the power in Washington, D.C. I don't think they're going to do that. I mean, for me, the most important question is what's the smallest thing they could do that would be that we would regard as escalatory. And I think we don't know the answer to that. There's certainly some big things they can do that would be escalatory. Interfering with NATO troop movements, for example, that are happening now as we speak. There's a bolstering of U.S. forces in Europe right now. They could, in fact, you could imagine cyber attacks that get into that mess that up or delay it and so on, just as a signal. Not that it would have any significant effect, but just as a signal that, hey, we can do this. How would we respond to that? That's an interesting question. I mean, it might not have any big effect, might not even be noticeable outside a bunch of specialists, but the specialists would know and the president would know, and they would have to take that into account. So I think the real question is how small an effect would have to be. And I think that's where the uncertainties are.
Well, with that, I think time she's up. We are at the top of the hour almost. I want to thank Herb and Sandra for joining us today, spending the last hour or so with us. Very insightful conversation. Hopefully it gives us a better sense of what's coming. What hopefully does not happen, of course, but what we may be seeing, unfortunately, in the next couple of days or weeks. With that, Herb, you've got a great book out about cyber threats to the nuclear arsenal. Everybody should pick that up. Of course, as we heard, Mandiant's got a great list of recommendations and defensive measures. And as you heard at the top of the show, we've also CISA and their Shields Up message. And you may have missed it at the beginning, but Garrett Graff also has a new book. It's right behind me over my shoulder. Watergate. And then if anyone is interested in more about Russian active measures and how they both use cyber capabilities, that information technical as well as the information psychological, there's another book over my shoulder here called Active Measures by Thomas Ridd. I recommend you check it out. So with that, thanks everybody. Hope you have a good afternoon and weekend.